The ballroom was glittering. Crystal chandeliers hung above round tables where our most important people sat. Investors, business partners, family friends. I was sitting next to my husband Marcus, wearing the navy dress I'd chosen weeks ago for his 50th birthday celebration. I thought I knew what tonight would be. A man I didn't recognize stood up with a champagne flute. He was one of Marcus's newer business associates, someone I'd met maybe twice. He clinked his glass loudly, and the room quieted. "To Marcus," he began, his voice booming with false familiarity, "for finally securing his legacy the way he always wanted. Congratulations on the heir on the way. Here's to new beginnings." The room erupted in applause before the words even landed on me. I froze. My champagne flute stopped halfway to my lips. My hand didn't shake. I wouldn't let it, but inside, something cracked. The man was still talking, saying something about fresh starts and the next generation, but I wasn't hearing him anymore. Marcus was next to me. He was clapping. He was smiling. He wasn't surprised. I kept my face steady. I've been trained since childhood to keep my face steady. My mother used to say that a woman's composure is her power, and I believed her. So I smiled. I lifted my glass higher. I even laughed when someone leaned over to congratulate Marcus on finally getting what he wanted. Around me, people were celebrating. They didn't understand what they'd just done. They'd handed me a grenade with the pin already pulled. And my husband was sitting beside me, accepting their congratulations like he'd won something. I could feel his eyes trying to find mine, but I wouldn't look at him. Instead, I focused on the ice melting in my drink, on the way the light caught the crystal, on anything that wasn't his face. A woman next to me, his mother actually, squeezed my hand. "How wonderful for you both," she whispered. I realized she was lying too. Or worse, she already knew. When the toast ended and the conversation moved forward, I excused myself to the bathroom. I locked the door. I stood in front of the mirror and looked at a woman I suddenly didn't recognize. She was holding together perfectly. Not a crack in the makeup. Not a tremor in the jaw. But her eyes. Those eyes knew something catastrophic had just happened. I was the last to know. And everyone else was congratulating him for it. We drove home in silence. Not the comfortable silence of two people who've been married for 22 years. This was the silence of collision. The moment before impact. The city lights passed us in streaks of color, and neither of us moved toward the radio or toward each other. When we got home, I went directly to his office. He followed me. "Elena, I can explain," he started, but I wasn't interested in explanations. I was interested in truth. "How long?" I asked. 2 years, he said. Then he added, like this made it better. "But it's practical. She's pregnant." I wanted to secure the legacy. Secure the legacy. As if our entire marriage hadn't been built on that exact promise. As if I hadn't spent the last 2 decades being the steady one, the strategic one, the one who thought about the future. "You updated the will," I said. It wasn't a question. He looked away. That was confirmation enough. I asked him one more time. "Does she know? Does she know about me?" "She knows you're my wife," he said carefully. Which meant she knew everything. Which meant while I was protecting his company during the worst financial crisis of his career, she was planning how to take it from me. I left his office and went to bed in the guest room. I didn't cry. Crying would have meant breaking, and I couldn't break. Not yet. Not while I still needed to think. I couldn't sleep, so I lay in the dark and inventoried my life. 22 years ago, I'd met Marcus at a business conference. He was brilliant. Ambitious, driven, visionary. But he was also chaotic. He'd have ideas at 3 in the morning and forget them by noon. He'd close deals and then panic about whether they were right. He needed someone to steady him. I became that person. When his business hit turbulence in year 7, I paused my own career. We needed someone to focus on the company full-time, and Marcus was too deep in the operational details to step back. So I stepped back from my promotion track instead. I became the strategist behind the scenes, the one who restructured contracts, renegotiated vendor agreements, rebuilt relationships with investors who were ready to leave. When his mother had a stroke in year 10, I became her caregiver. I hired nurses, managed her medications, drove her to appointments. Marcus loved her, but he was too emotionally overwhelmed to handle the logistics. So I handled the logistics. When the company nearly foreclosed in year 15, I was the one who convinced the bank to extend our credit line. I sat in meetings with our creditors and presented restructuring plans I'd spent months designing. I saved the company that year. Not him. Me. And every single time he thanked me. He called me his backbone. He said he couldn't do it without me. He promised that one day, all of this would be reflected in how we secured our future together. One day. That was his promise. One day, I wouldn't have to be the steady one anymore. One day I could rest. But one day never came. Instead, he started building a future with someone else. I didn't sleep that night, so by dawn I was sitting in my office, the small one downstairs that I used for my consulting work, thinking about a conversation from 6 years ago. Marcus had collapsed at work. Just collapsed. The doctors said it was stress-related, that his heart was fine, but they wanted to do more testing. For 2 weeks, while we waited for results, we were both terrified. He kept trying to hide it, kept trying to work, but I could see the fear underneath. One night, he asked me to promise something. If anything happens to me, he said, you'll take care of everything. You'll run the company. You'll make sure we're protected. I'd promised. And I'd insisted on something practical. Something born from that fear and that love. I insisted that we create a formal trust structure, irrevocable and clear. I insisted that it specify what would happen to his assets, to the company, if something happened to him. He'd resisted at first. He said it felt like tempting fate. But I pushed. I was always good at pushing when it mattered. We'd gone to his attorney, a man named William who'd handled his business matters for years, and we'd created it. An irrevocable trust with specific conditions. The kind that, once created, couldn't just be changed or destroyed. It required consent, specific triggers, documented circumstances. I'd insisted on that detail because I loved him. Because I wanted to protect him, protect us. I never imagined I'd need to protect myself from him. I called William at 7 in the morning. His secretary said he wasn't in yet, but I told her to have him call me immediately. He did, within an hour, probably because he recognized the tone in my voice. I need to know about the trust we created 6 years ago, I said. I need to know if it can be overridden. There was a pause on the line. Elena, what's happening? Can it be overridden? I repeated. Not easily, he said slowly. It was structured to be irrevocable, with specific conditions. Why? I explained. Not everything. Just enough for him to understand that Marcus had attempted to fundamentally alter the succession plan and that I needed to know my legal position. The trust has a misconduct clause, William said after I finished. It's triggered if a trustee engages in material deception or hidden transfers of assets. If Marcus created a new will without disclosing the existence of the prior trust, that would be documentation of the clause being triggered. What does that mean? I asked. It means, he said carefully, that the original trust still controls the majority of the assets. His new will can't override an irrevocable structure. But you would need to prove that the conditions have been met. I thanked him and hung up. For the first time since that toast, I felt something other than devastation. I felt clarity. And I felt the cold, precise awareness that I had made one good decision years ago when I wasn't trying to protect myself from betrayal. I was just trying to protect what we'd built together. While I was sitting with William, Marcus was doing something stupidly arrogant. He was introducing the pregnant mistress to investors. I found out through our company's events coordinator, who mentioned that Marcus had asked for a private meeting room for a personal matter. Then our lead investor happened to see them together and mentioned it casually at a board update. She was young, maybe 28. Her name was Victoria, and she worked in marketing for one of our partner firms. I'd seen her at company events maybe 5 times. She was beautiful in that effortless way that people who've never had to work for anything often are. Marcus had brought her to the private meeting room like she was already part of our empire. He'd probably told her about the will. He'd probably promised her that soon, she'd be more than just his pregnant girlfriend. Soon, she'd be the one holding the future. I wondered if she knew about me. If she understood that I wasn't just some obstacle to be cleared away, but the actual architect of everything he was trying to hand her. Probably not. She probably just knew that he was rich, that he was promised, that she'd won. But he hadn't won yet. And neither had she. The deeper I looked, the worse it got. I had access to the company accounts. Access Marcus had given me years ago when he trusted me to manage the financial side of his vision. I started pulling statements, cross-referencing them with the trusts we'd set up. 3 months ago, Marcus had quietly transferred 5% of the company's shares to a trust he'd created in Victoria's name. 5%. That was substantial. That was intentional. But here's what made it worse. Those shares were restricted. They couldn't be transferred again without consent from the original trust, the irrevocable one we'd created together. He'd tried to give her something he didn't actually have the authority to give. I documented everything. The transfer date, the amount, the account it came from. I created a spreadsheet, the same way I'd created every strategic plan that had ever saved his company, and I laid out exactly what he'd done and when he'd done it. As I worked, I realized something that made my chest tight. He hadn't just been unfaithful. He'd been incompetent in his infidelity. He'd tried to commit financial fraud without understanding the actual legal constraints on his assets. The man I'd spent 2 decades making look brilliant had finally tried to do something brilliant on his own, and he'd failed spectacularly. By week 2, rumors were circulating. I heard them at the grocery store, where a friend of a friend mentioned that Marcus must be past his prime if he needed a younger woman. I heard them at the country club, where women I'd known for years suddenly started making careful eye contact, their voices full of concern that couldn't quite hide satisfaction. But the worst rumors were about me. I was unable to give him children. I was cold and career-focused, which apparently translated to not woman enough. I was the reason he'd had to look elsewhere. I'd built my entire identity on being steady, strategic, competent. And suddenly, competence was being reframed as coldness. Strength was being reframed as brittleness. A board meeting was scheduled for the following week. Marcus had called it, and I knew exactly what he planned to do. He was going to announce that he was stepping back, that Victoria was going to have a consulting role with the company, that the future was going to look different. He was going to do it publicly. He was going to make it impossible for me to respond without looking like a scorned woman trying to cling to what was never hers. But he didn't know what I'd found. And he didn't know that I was done being careful about how I looked. I made copies of every document. The original trust, the subsequent will, the share transfers, the communications between Marcus and the attorney about his updated legacy plans. I organized them chronologically. I color-coded them. I created a summary that was clear enough for a judge to understand but complex enough that Marcus's lawyers wouldn't be able to dismiss it easily. Then I found something that made everything click into place. The affair had started before he'd updated the will. 3 weeks before, actually. Which meant the new will hadn't been created because of a spontaneous attraction or a midlife crisis. It had been created because he was already planning this. Because he'd decided, while he was with me, while I was still the steady one, that he wanted someone else to inherit what I'd helped build. That timeline mattered. That timeline was the difference between a terrible marriage and fraud. I highlighted it in red. I made notes in the margins. And I sat back and realized that I had everything I needed. Not to win. Exactly. I didn't care about winning anymore. But to prove that this wasn't betrayal born from passion or mistake. This was betrayal born from calculation. I finally confronted Marcus directly. Not at home. Not in anger. I did it at his office, in the morning, before anyone else arrived. "How long have you known Victoria?" I asked. He looked caught. "Elena, this isn't." "How long?" 2.5 years, he admitted. I'd calculated correctly. The timeline I'd found was accurate. "And when did you update the will?" 2 years ago, he said quietly. "So you met her, spent a month with her, and then updated your will to make sure she'd get everything we've built together." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence was the answer. "I was still saving the company then," I continued. "I was still restructuring our debt. I was still being the steady one. And you were already planning how to erase me." He tried to reach for me, but I stepped back. "Elena, I love you. But I can't be what you need me to be anymore. I need something different. You needed me to build a company worth giving away," I said. "And now you've found someone you want to give it to. I understand. But I'm not going to make this easy for you." I met with William and with a financial auditor named Catherine. We sat in Catherine's office on a Tuesday afternoon, and I laid out everything I'd found. the transfers, the timeline, the misconduct clause. This is well documented, Catherine said carefully, reviewing my spreadsheets. But you understand what you're about to do? I understand, I said. Once you file, there's no going back. The marriage is over. Everything will be contested. Your privacy is gone. My privacy is already gone, I said. Everyone in our circle knows. I'd rather control the narrative than have it controlled for me. William nodded. The good news is that the trust is clear. If we can demonstrate that Marcus attempted to circumvent it through deception, the original structure holds. You retain control of the majority assets. But I could hear the qualifier in his tone. But you'll need to prove that his new will was created with material knowledge of the prior trust and an intent to circumvent it. Your documentation helps. But he'll argue he forgot, that he thought it could be overridden. Then we need to make sure he can't argue that, I said. We spent the next 3 hours building a case. Not for winning, but for clarity. For making sure that when this went public, everyone understood exactly what had happened and why. Marcus filed the new will 2 weeks later. He did it quietly, without telling me, probably thinking that if he just made it official enough, it would become real enough that I couldn't fight it. He was wrong. He also started announcing it. Not directly but through implication. At a business dinner, he mentioned that his succession plans had evolved. In an email to his board, he referenced exciting new directions for leadership. He was treating it like a done deal, like the future had already been decided. I watched him construct this false certainty, and I felt something almost like pity. He'd spent our entire marriage letting me do the hard work of building the future. He'd never learned how to actually protect what he had. He was about to learn that lesson very quickly. The company was hosting its annual anniversary gala in 3 weeks. Marcus had already announced that he would be making a major announcement about succession. I assumed he was going to introduce Victoria publicly as the future of the company. He had no idea that I was going to introduce something else. The ballroom was identical to the one where this had started. All crystal and glittering light, full of people who thought they understood what was about to happen. I wore white. Not the navy dress I'd worn to his birthday. White, clean, untouched by shadow. I did my hair and makeup carefully. I wanted to look like someone in control, not someone in crisis. Marcus had spent the evening working the room, confident and expansive. He'd introduced Victoria to several key investors, calling her his future partner, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. She looked nervous, probably sensing for the first time that this world was more complicated than she'd realized. When the gala reached its planned moment, when Marcus was supposed to take the stage, William stood up instead. He stood up and asked for the microphone. Marcus's face went white. He knew in that instant that something had shifted. William's voice was calm, professional, kind even. I'm William Harris, counsel for this family and this company. I'm here to clarify a matter of legal importance regarding the company's ownership structure and succession plan. The room went completely silent. William didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He simply stated facts, the way lawyers do when the facts are powerful enough to stand alone. In 2019, Mr. Marcus and his wife Elena created an irrevocable trust designed to protect the company and its assets in the event of unforeseen circumstances. This trust has specific conditions and cannot be easily overridden. I watched Marcus's face. He was calculating, trying to figure out how much William knew, how much I'd told. In recent months, there have been attempts to modify the succession plan through the creation of a new will. However, that will does not supersede the prior trust structure. The irrevocable trust still controls the majority of the company assets. This is ridiculous, Marcus started, but William continued smoothly. Additionally, the trust contains a misconduct clause. This clause is triggered when a trustee attempts to conceal material assets or engage in hidden transfers. The timeline of events suggests that this clause has been triggered. The room erupted. Not in anger, but in confused murmuring. Investors were looking at each other. Board members were trying to understand what this meant. Victoria looked like she was about to get sick. And Marcus looked small. Smaller than I'd ever seen him. William explained the misconduct clause with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed it carefully. The clause was designed to protect the trust from being exploited or circumvented through hidden transfers or undisclosed relationships. Evidence suggests that Mr. Marcus created a new will while maintaining a significant undisclosed relationship, with the intention of altering the succession plan in favor of that relationship. He also transferred company shares to an account associated with this undisclosed relationship without proper disclosure or consent. I disclosed everything, Marcus said, standing up. His voice was shaking. She knew. Did Elena know? William asked, his voice still calm. Your wife, who you promised to honor, to protect, to include in major decisions? Did she know? Marcus couldn't answer. The evidence suggests she didn't. Which means the misconduct clause applies. The original trust structure remains valid and binding. The new will cannot override it. I watched understanding dawn on the investors' faces. I watched them realize what this meant, that the company's future was secure, that the woman who'd actually built this company wasn't being erased, that betrayal had a cost. Marcus sat down slowly. Victoria quietly excused herself from the room. The gala dissolved into controlled chaos. Board members surrounded William with questions. Investors were trying to figure out what their investments meant in this new reality. The social contract that had seemed so certain moments ago was suddenly rewritten. My mother-in-law, the woman whose hand I'd held countless times, whose medications I'd managed, whose care I'd provided when her own son was too overwhelmed, walked directly to me. Her eyes were sharp. I always knew you were the strong one, she said. I just never thought he was foolish enough to forget it. She hugged me. Just like that, in front of everyone. Like I was hers, like she was claiming me, like she was saying that she'd always known which daughter-in-law actually mattered. Other people approached me with congratulations dressed as concern. They were relieved, I realized. They'd been watching Marcus hand control of the company to someone with no experience, and they'd been terrified about what that meant for their investments. Now they knew that the actual competent person was still in charge. Marcus tried to approach me, but I simply turned away. There was nothing left to say. The legal documents would speak now. The contracts would speak. The assets would speak. Words were irrelevant. Within 48 hours, the financial structures began shifting. The shares Marcus had transferred to Victoria became restricted. She couldn't access them, couldn't sell them, couldn't do anything with them without consent from the original trust, which meant consent from me. Several of his personal accounts were frozen pending legal review. His authority to make unilateral decisions at the company ended with a formal notice from the board. I watched him try to maintain control. He called emergency meetings. He tried to reframe the situation. He attempted to negotiate directly with key investors. But it was too late. The momentum had shifted. Everyone who'd been willing to overlook his infidelity when he seemed powerful suddenly saw him for what he was. A man having a midlife crisis who'd nearly destroyed a successful company because he wanted to feel young again. His emergency meetings went nowhere. His negotiations fell flat. By the fourth day, even his secretary was treating him differently. I watched all of this from a distance. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I just documented the fallout and made sure that my legal position was as secure as it could be. On the fifth day, Marcus showed up at my office. He looked destroyed. His suit was rumpled. He hadn't shaved. His eyes were red in a way that suggested he'd either cried or not slept or both. Elena, please, he said. His voice was hoarse. You can fix this. You could tell William to drop the claim. You could reverse the legal action, you could. No, I said. You don't understand what you're doing. Victoria's gone. She left as soon as she realized there was no money. But the company is suffering, the board is in chaos, and our marriage. Our marriage ended the moment you decided I was replaceable, I said. I'm not ending it. You already did. He tried to reach for me, actually reached out his hand. I made a mistake. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was going through something and I... Stop, I said. I don't want to hear explanations or apologies or promises that you'll do better. I want you to understand something very clearly. I am not saving you anymore. You can hire the best lawyers in the country. You can try to fight this in court. But I documented everything, I have evidence of every step, and I have more patience than you have resources to fight me with. The only question now is how expensive you want to make this. He stood there, trying to process a world where I wasn't going to fix things for him. The papers will be served on Monday, I continued. I suggest you contact your attorney. The business community is smaller than people think. By the end of the week, everyone knew. The narrative reversed completely. Instead of Marcus being a visionary who'd finally secured his legacy, he was a fool who'd nearly destroyed a company because of an affair. Instead of me being the cold wife who'd driven him away, I was this strategic genius who'd protected the company from disaster. Ironic, how the exact same qualities I'd been criticized for suddenly became valuable when they protected other people's investments. The board moved quickly to formalize my position. They asked me to serve as interim trustee while the legal matters resolved. I accepted. I told them I would restructure the leadership, stabilize the finances, and present a 5-year growth plan within 30 days. I'd already drafted it. I always drafted everything in advance. Within a week, the company's stock price stabilized. Investors who'd been nervous began reinvesting. Key employees who'd been updating their resumes started making long-term plans again. I was doing what I'd always done. Saving the company, making it secure, building the future. But this time, the future was only mine. The court process was slower than the financial collapse, but the outcome was never in doubt. The judge reviewed the irrevocable trust, examined the timeline of the affair and the updated will, and ruled that the misconduct clause had been validly triggered. The new will was set aside. The original trust structure remained in effect. Marcus was entitled to his personal assets, the money he'd brought into the marriage, and a portion of the company's value based on our prenuptial agreement. An agreement I'd insisted on before we even married, back when I was still protecting him from the world. But the company itself, the bulk of the assets, the future, that was controlled by the trust. And I controlled the trust. The judge looked at me as she made her final ruling. I think she understood what this had cost me. I think she understood that this wasn't victory, it was survival. Mrs. Elena, she said, you've demonstrated exceptional foresight and integrity in protecting the assets of this family. I hope you'll use that wisdom to rebuild what's been broken. I nodded. I had no plans to rebuild the marriage. But I had very clear plans for everything else. 3 months after the court ruling, I did something that shocked everyone, including myself. I set aside a trust for Marcus's unborn child. Not because Marcus deserved it, but because the child didn't deserve to inherit their father's mistakes. I allocated enough to ensure that when that child turned 18, they would have options. They would have education. They would have a foundation that wasn't built on lies. The move completely changed the narrative. Suddenly, I wasn't the scorned woman destroying her husband's reputation. I was the generous woman who'd been betrayed but still had enough compassion to protect an innocent child. The business community noticed. More importantly, the public noticed. Articles started appearing about me, the woman who rebuilt her family's legacy. Strategic genius or victim? How Elena turned betrayal into vision. I didn't do interviews. I didn't explain myself. I just let people draw their own conclusions. But I made sure everyone understood that I'd chosen to allocate resources for the child not because I was grateful for the affair, but because integrity meant something to me, even when it was inconvenient. I stepped into the CEO role officially 6 months after the gala. But I changed the company's structure. I promoted the people who'd actually done the work instead of the people who'd taken credit for it. I restructured the pay so that competence was rewarded, not just seniority. I brought in women for leadership roles, women who understood strategy, who'd been overlooked, who wanted to prove that there were better ways to run companies than through ego and manipulation. I stopped being the woman behind the scenes. I became the woman at the center of things. And I realized something profound. I wasn't the same person who'd married Marcus. That person had believed that loyalty meant security, that sacrifice meant love, that being steady was the same as being strong. I'd learned differently. I'd learned that strength means sometimes you have to be cold. That vision means sometimes you have to be willing to destroy what you've built rather than let it be stolen. That the greatest legacy isn't what you create. It's what you protect. For the first time in my adult life, my identity wasn't tied to someone else's success. It was just mine. A year after becoming CEO, I launched the Elena Foundation. It provided funding and mentorship for women in business who were overlooked, underestimated, or treated as supporting characters in their own stories. I wanted to change that pattern. I wanted to create a world where women didn't have to choose between being competent and being loved. I funded research into the psychology of family systems, into how women are trained to be useful rather than valued. I created scholarships for young women in financial analysis, in business strategy, in the fields where I'd made my mark. The foundation wasn't just about business success. It was about changing the belief systems that had allowed my husband to betray me in the first place. The belief that a woman's worth is determined by her usefulness to someone else. I gave interviews now. I spoke at conferences. I told my story not as a victim, but as a witness to what happens when we stop asking women to be steady and start asking them to be seen. The company grew. The foundation expanded. And I built a life that belonged entirely to me. I saw Marcus once, about 2 years after everything settled. It was at a business conference. He was with someone new. I didn't recognize her, and frankly, I didn't care enough to find out who she was. He looked smaller than he had at the gala, like this version of betrayal and consequence had diminished him. He tried to approach me, but I simply nodded politely and turned away. There was nothing left to say between us. The legal documents had said everything. The court had said everything. My life, moving forward without him, said everything. Walking away, I thought about that conversation 6 years ago, when he'd asked me to promise to protect everything if something happened to him. I had protected it. Just not in the way he'd imagined. The truth I'd learned wasn't complicated. Legacy isn't what you leave behind when you die. It's what you build while you're alive, the evidence of your integrity, the structures you create not to protect someone else's future, but to secure your own. The document I'd insisted on years ago, the one born from kindness and fear, had become my salvation. Not because I'd planned it that way, but because I'd always trusted myself more than I trusted fate. And that trust had been rewarded. I am no longer the wife who saved her husband. I am the woman who saved herself. And I am finally, completely, at last, the main character of my own story.